We'll wait for a couple of more minutes, sir, for more people to join in, and then we can begin.
You are the boss.
Privilege, sir. So if you remember me, sir, I used to work at Claus, and I believe you're still in the board of selection committee there at Center for Land Warfare Studies, sir.
Yes, what we call Research Council.
Yes, sir, Research Council.
Yes, I was there. I'm still there.
Yes, sir.
Because he was in the national security one,
sir,
probably more questions will be on the national security arena. So that's what I would like to make the presentation shorter, so that you have a more space to ask me questions.
Sir, just to make a mention, sir, our director is here, sir, Lieutenant General Asit Misri, sir. Sir.
Hello, General.
Hello, Professor. How are you?
I'm fine, sir. I'm fine, sir. Thanks for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and honored to be here. This is the first time. And I hope I live up to your expectations of creating an interest in the subject.
Thank you for sparing time for us. Thank you very much.
We can start, sir. May I have your permission to start, sir?
Please do, please.
Sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty members, and scholars who have joined us from various universities, including Rashtriya Raksha University. We have with us today Professor Kumaraswamy. Professor Kumaraswamy is an honorary director at the Middle East Institute, New Delhi, and professor at School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was a research fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel from year 1991 to 1999. Ever since joining JNU in September 1999, he has been researching, teaching, and writing on various aspects of contemporary Middle East. His knowledge and authority on Israel is unparalleled, and his works include India's Israel policy and India-Israel relations. So the topic of the lecture today is India-Israel relations. And we could have, I think, sir is one of the very prominent speaker, I think one of the foremost scholar on the topic. So just for a couple of housekeeping before I hand over to the speaker, I would just like to highlight few, just to give a brief about the topic which we are going to discuss today, which is India-Israel relationship. So India announced its recognition of Israel on September 17th, 1950. And soon thereafter, the Jewish agency established an immigration office in Bombay, and thereafter with a trade office and subsequently a consulate. Embassies on both sides were open in 1992 when the full diplomatic relationship was established. Since the upgradation of the relations in 1992, defense as well as agriculture has been the two main foundation pillars of the bilateral agreement. And in recent years, relations have been has seen rapid growth across a broad of spectrum, and as the future vision of cooperation is of strong high-tech partnership as befits two knowledge economies. In recent years, the increased high-level exchanges and the ministerial visits on both sides have expanded cooperation in different functional areas such as trade, agriculture, science and technology, as well as security. Recently, Prime Minister Narendra Modi undertook an historic first ever visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Israel, which was during 4th to 6th July 2017, during which the relationship was upgraded to a strategic level, and various agreements, around 7 agreements and MOUs were signed in field of research and development, innovation, water management system, agriculture, as well as space. And both countries, since facing somewhat similar security challenges in their respective regions, both countries have established extensive defense and security cooperation. India imports critical defense technologies from Israel, and both countries have continued to have regular exchanges between the to armed forces. Other than defense sector, India and Israel share cooperation in domains like agriculture, cooperation in science and technology, education, as well as diaspora. So before I hand over to the speaker, the rules for the house is that you can ask your question in the chat box when sir finishes, or you can directly ask your question directly to the speaker. Please keep yourself mute unless you're speaking. And you can, of course, like I said, you can mention your question in the chat box. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, my friend, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm very delighted to be here for what I would call what appears to be an informed audience. And since the introduction has covered the issues, I will only put broad time frames. And we are talking about 100 years of relations. And by the way, this week I completed 40 years of studying Israel. My journey began in 1982, so this is actually a 40th year of my pursuing my interest in Israel. So if you look at the 100 years history, from about 1920 to 1992, what I would call the parallel track, that is that is in the sense zero-sum game. India approached Israel and the pre-state Israel with the view that having a relationship with the Jewish agency and the Zionist movement and Israel is anti-Palestinian. So if you are supporting the Palestinian cause, you have to be anti-Israeli. Anti-Israeli in the sense you cannot even have a normal diplomatic relations. And you recognize in 1950 that the relations had to wait till 92. And India fought wars with Pakistan and China, but that did not prevent New Delhi from having a normal diplomatic relations with both the countries. That was not the case in Israel. That is why you say it's a zero-sum game. That is, your support for the Palestinian cause was reflected by India not talking to Israel. So from 92 to 2014, what I would call the parallel track. India was talking to the Israelis, India was talking to the Palestinians. We were trying to balance the two. So every time there was a visit or contact with Israel, India was making pro-Palestinian state. The third phase began in 2004 when UPA government took office. So during the 10-year period, what was happening was what I would call non-parallel track. That is, India was dealing with Israel as if there is no peace process. And India was dealing with the peace process as if there is no relations with Israel. Meaning, we were criticizing Israel on various issues like borders, settlement, Jerusalem, and everything, even while pursuing bilateral relations with Israel. This is almost an antithesis of pre-92 position. Before 92, because of our disagreements with the larger issues, we were not ready to talk to the Israelis. But now, in spite of the differences, we were ready to talk to the Israelis. And that is why you will find India even launching a satellite of Israel, which is supposed to be aimed at Iran. So that was the third phase. The fourth phase began when Prime Minister Narendra Modi took office. That is a rather interesting phase. What he did was, he normalized Israel in India's larger Middle East policy. I think that is a great contribution. Previously, India was dealing Israel as if it is in space. We never dealt Israel within the regional context. And if you look at the statements, Israel figured prominently in our dealings with all the Arab and Islamic countries. But after Narendra Modi took over, Israel became another country in the Middle East. Meaning, you no longer have to keep the bilateral relations under the closet. It is out in the open. And previously, we never had that. And if you look at the 10 years of UPA government, Israelis could not even meet senior officials. The visits were very limited, and most of the contacts were primarily through the Ministry of Defense, nowhere else. And that is the time the Israelis recognized we need to diversify. So under the UPA government, rather than focusing their attention on New Delhi, Israelis began to spread out to different parts of the country. What I would call the decentralization of bilateral relations. While Delhi was important, much more productive engagement was taking place in the state governments. The state governments were governed by different political parties: Congress, BJP, and the regional parties. And Israel found an interesting advantage. In Delhi, the priority was peace process. So what are you doing with the settlements? What are you doing with the Palestinian state? That was a priority in New Delhi. But in the state governments, the priority was economic development, agriculture, water management, farming. They are not interested in the peace process. So the Palestinian state was not the priority of the state governments. They simply say, talk to the South Bloc. With the result, it suited Israel tremendously. Israel was able to reach out to various states of this country based on economic and developmental issues. And therefore, you are developing what I would call a grassroots support for the bilateral relations. The foreign relation was no longer the hobby of a few elites like me, but rather it is directly affecting the population on the ground. A farmer is getting more produce for with less number of water. So the agricultural technology of Israel was plunged into Indian rural areas. It also had a political advantage. You know, in the urban elites will talk about boycotting Israel. We will boycott Israeli products, we will boycott Israeli technology, we will boycott Israeli films and artists and everything. The question you have to ask is, are you going to boycott wheat from Punjab grown with Israeli irrigation technology? So therefore, the whole dynamics was changing. So the decentralization not only exposed Israel to state governments, but the state governments are also benefiting from the Israeli technology. But under Narendra Modi, you have a redefinition of strategic partnership. Previously, when you use the word strategic partnership, it is primarily military. What kind of weapons you are supplying, what kind of arms and ammunition. If you read the joint declaration, which was issued when Prime Minister Modi went to Israel in July 2017, military doesn't figure. The most prominent issue was water security. You know, it basically means, tell me, when was the last time you thought water would be a very critical component in foreign relations? And because in the Indian context, it means agriculture, rural development, farming, and GDP, all of them put together. And therefore, what has happened under Prime Minister Modi is a redefinition of strategic partnership. It is not that the military is not there, but the strategic dimensions have changed. And that is visible when Netanyahu came to India the following January. And that is the broad picture. But since it is a national security program, let me also say a few things. The military relations between India and Israel predates normalization. When India was establishing RAW, the senior Indian official was sent to Israel for consultation. And that was done by none other than Mrs. Gandhi. So at one level, you don't have a political relationship. At other level, you recognize this is important for national security. Similarly, whenever India was fighting a war, Indian leaders did not hesitate to contact Israel. This was true for Prime Minister Nehru. It was true for Lal Bahadur Shastri. It was true for Mrs. Gandhi. Whenever there was a crisis, Israel was there in some form or the other, from 1962, 65, 71. Even after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, the Prime Minister's security consulted Israel for what you would call the Black Cat and all the other formation. Some of the weapons used by the elite forces that Israeli made when India was officially not talking to Israel. So Israeli cooperation in the military sector was very much there. Probably General might know more than I do, but the Israeli 67 June war was widely studied in the Indian defense establishment. So therefore, at the one level, you don't have a political relationship. At other level, you are willing to look at various Israeli expertise. And this has become more formal after 92. But it's still, I would say, work in progress, even after nearly 30 years. Because in the initial years, our priority was upgrading the aging Soviet inventories. We did not have the resources to buy new equipments. So therefore, we decided to upgrade the Soviet weapons. That was first priority. The second priority was we decided what I would call cash and carry model. You go and buy weapons and bring it to India. That's the second phase. Much of the 90s and early 2000, that's what happened. And then came a whole range of other issues: counterterrorism, border fencing, intelligence, cybersecurity, and the whole range of issues. And these kind of issues you cannot quantify in terms of money or in terms of the benefits. But what Israel has done over a period of time was raising to the occasion to face a threat. In 1967, suddenly France decided not to supply weapons to Israel. They even refused to supply weapons for which Israel has paid for. And that forced Israel to indigenize the system. If Israel emerges today as one of the top 10 arms exporter, it was primarily because of 1967, the French decision. It basically means, like an individual, nations also start from defeat, not from victory. Victory is a bad teacher, as Vivekananda often says. So the Israelis learned after 67 to redefine their arms industry. And I think that is what it is happening. And there were attempts between India and Israel at a minor level, in the sense, you assemble the Israeli weapons in India. That's still not very promising. The Make in India could be an alternative, but I'm not very sure given our efficiency level. Because we generally, as a nation, we don't walk the talk. What we say and what we do are two different things. It doesn't tally. And I think that is how it is. And cyber security and technology transfers are very, very useful. But we have to remember one thing. No country transfers technology. Let's be very honest. If they transfer the technology to you, which basically means that technology is no longer wanted by the home country. It is obsolete, so I sell it to somebody else. So to expect Israel or any country to sell technology to India is simply an unrealistic proposition. Then what do? You can do two things. One, you can steal. You can steal technologies. There are various means, just like you download a book before paying for it. There are a million ways you can actually steal a technology. But the drawback is you cannot build an arms industry by stealing technology. You cannot. You can probably learn one or two things. You cannot build your inventory by stealing technology. Therefore, the most efficient way of technology transfer is buying the companies, outright buying, or having a share. I think this is where India should focus on Israel. That is, technological companies in Israel, India should actually invest. You should need a share, and therefore you actually have a ownership of technology. And this is relevant, especially for cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Israelis are not going to do that because no country does. Okay. If we look at the Israeli-China behavior in the last 10 years, especially after Netanyahu's tenure, the Chinese-Israeli relations have expanded enormously in the economic realm, not in the military realm. And China is building ports, tunnels, roads, railway system, you name it. The entire infrastructure, China has a great role in that. And the Chinese company, all the major companies have invested in Israeli high-tech industry. And this is creating a problem between Israel and the United States. But for us, what is important is it gives you a model. This is what the model for Israel is. Our advantage is Israel is not very paranoid about India. United States is not very unhappy with Indo-Israel relations. US is more than happy if India joins hands. And this gives us an enormous opportunity for exploration. So the Indo-Israeli relations, merely transaction is gone. Joint research and development is possible, but it has a lot of difficulties because there is an uneven strength. The future will be more about Indian investments in Israeli high-tech industry. Having said that, we are moving in a very new terrain. So far, the relations were bilateral. And two things happened. One, under Prime Minister Modi, we delinked Israel from Palestine. It's a very swift strategic move. Until 2017, all the Indian visitors to Israel also went to Palestine. Foreign Minister Jaswant Singh, S.M. Krishna, and even Sushma Swaraj. Even President Pranab Mukherjee also went to Palestine. So it meant if you want to go to Israel, you have to go to Palestine. And Prime Minister Modi broke that. He broke at two levels. One, in May 2017, just weeks before his Israel trip, he invited the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And he said that no, India is supporting the creation of an independent Palestinian state coexisting with Israel. What was interesting was there was no reference to East Jerusalem as a capital of a Palestinian state. Until then, for over 10 years, the Indian leaders always talked about a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as a capital. You will find this even a few statements issued under the Modi government before 2017. In 2017, he simply dropped East Jerusalem. And then a few weeks later, he goes to Israel without visiting Ramallah. You know, if you look at the topography of Ramallah, Ramallah is only one side of the road is Jerusalem, the other side of the road is Ramallah, as its outskirts of Jerusalem. He refuses to go. And the following February, he goes to Ramallah without going to Israel. Which basically means I'm going to deal with Israel purely on a bilateral level. This is once again in line with an Indian policy. In the sense, we no longer like the Indo-Pakistan hyphenation. Whoever comes to India should come to India. If you want to go to Pakistan, he can go. The most visible example is Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He comes to Pakistan, and then he had to go back to Riyadh. After a couple of hours, he comes back to Delhi. Just to prove a point, there is no hyphenation. And therefore, if India wants other countries to de-hyphenate India and Pakistan, we are also ready to do the same thing. So the de-hyphenation of Israel and Palestine was very clearly demonstrated under Modi. And therefore, when Jaishankar goes to Israel October, he never went to Ramallah. Not only that, if you look at the 5 days, he met scores of officials, lot of statements, the P word was missing, Palestine. And it's a very clear demonstration that we are going to deal with both of them separately. The second dimension is India is integrating Israel in the wider Middle East policy. And that is how I read the Quad. And Quad comprising of India, Israel, US, and Emirates. And people say it's a mini Quad and everything. It is a rather interesting from the bigger one. As much as we know, it is not directed against any third country. I think people tried to bring Iran into the picture. Hindu even carried an editorial. And most of the former diplomats brought in China as a factor. And that if you look at the Israel's relations with China, Emirati relations with China, they cannot afford to join any anti-China forum. It's suicidal for both of them. And it is not against a third country, but it is primarily working towards economic cooperation. If you read the Israeli press, they are talking about other countries joining the forum, including Greece, Egypt, Jordan, and France. So you are thinking of probably, as I argued earlier, you need to look for a different name for this. No longer is going to be Quad because there will be more than Quad. What does it tell you? It tells you India not only is comfortable in dealing with Israel, but it is also cooperating with Israel in third countries. And that is made possible by the Abraham Accord. The normalization of Gulf-Israel relations has opened up new avenues for India. So you no longer have to deal with India bilaterally. You can deal with India at a multilateral level. That is in collaboration with other countries. It has a number of advantages. That is literally sky is the limit. And both Emirates and Israel is cooperating in enormous ways. You read the media yesterday, they announced there is a daily flight from Abu Dhabi to Israel. The number of flights are simply astronomical. And the kind of cooperation they have is huge, especially in science and technology. And we all know that at once upon a time, Abu Dhabi and other countries, other rulers had a large number of personnel from South Asia, mostly Pakistan, for that personal security. I'm thinking that all the personal security will be now governed by automation. And that's why Israel is going to become a very, very heavy player in that. And both are driven towards innovation. And if you look at the Dubai ports, it's one of the massive in the world. And that will be very active in Israel. And therefore, India joining the forum is actually good for India. And it may not be good for the other two countries. For the simple reason, we have a very long gestation period. Time doesn't exist. And if you're familiar with in Hindi, yesterday is kal and tomorrow is kal. Until the sentence is completed, you don't know what I'm talking about, a past or a future. And therefore, we don't have a sense of time. And now it is difficult for us to work with Emirates and Israel because they wanted it yesterday. That is a slogan. We wanted it yesterday. And therefore, by collaborating with them, we'll have to act faster. I'll just give an example. In 2015, Prime Minister went to Abu Dhabi, and one of the agreement was Abu Dhabi will invest to the tune of $75 billion in India. Ask them how much money has come. And the same thing, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said, we will invest up to $100 billion in India. How much has come? Because if you look at it, in the Indian system, both the government and the private sector are thinking in terms of small cornerstone behavior, cornerstone. So we don't have a companies of the scale and size which is needed for massive undertakings. And therefore, we need to work. So the Quran conveys a meaning that we not only are out of the crossroads with Israel, we are dealing with Israel more openly, but we are dealing with Israel in a much more confident manner. And once again, it is not we are reacting to a ground reality. You make foreign policy not in abstract level. You react to the ground realities, you are react to the changing dynamics, and you are capitalizing on the opportunities. I think that is what is happening at this point of time. What I will do is I will stop here and open the questions. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, sir, for providing us with such an analytical, I think, understanding of India-Israel relations and issues related to it. I think now we enter into since Sir has expressed that he wants to have question answer session, I think interactive session more than just his part. So we open up for a question answer session. If you have questions, you can directly ask Sir. You have the liberty to ask Sir. And if you want me to ask, I'm there to moderate, and you can type your question in the chat box. And I would encourage our students from School of Internal Security, Defense and Strategic Studies to ask questions to Sir. Floor is open. I believe so. We have a question, sir, and it's from Akanksha. She's a student here. She asked that India and Israel got independence a year apart, and do you think that India would have established its strategic partnership in 90s? Maybe India would have been strong as Israel in terms of military capabilities. Maybe we could have defeated China in 1962.
One thing Israel is going to teach all of us is, if you have a problem, you have to find your own solution. Nobody is going to solve your problem. And that is why if you look at Israel's behavior from 49 till today, Israel relies heavily on the American political and military support. It gets the arms from the United States, the latest arms. It gets the military aid and assistance every year. I know they said one thing very clearly. We don't want American soldiers on our soil. And I think that, which basically means you have the confidence to do it yourself. So you think that, Israel, for me, it teaches by its example. Rather than what Israel can give it to me, I am more interested in what Israel can teach me. Because I had a chance to live there for about 10 years. It exposed me the kind of things they are doing. In the first Intifada, I was in Israel. And one of the things which people in Jerusalem felt was pelting by stone pelting. And they used to attack the glasses of the buses, and it will injure the passenger. And then what they did was, okay, you cannot prevent the Palestinian from stoning you. That may happen. You cannot put soldiers there. But what you can do is, you cannot prevent the buses from being stoned also. You cannot put a armored car personnel before the bus. But what you can do is, you can develop a glass system which will not splinter. And that's why even if you stone them, the injuries to the passenger is zero. That is what it is saying. So every country you have a challenge. It is up to the scientific community to live up to the challenge and find the solution. I think that is what Israel is going to teach us. Defeating China, I think, we could have done it then, we could have done it today also. But the question is reading the other side correctly. I think that is what we should do it. Foreign relation is not an emotional exercise. It doesn't depend on good intention. The question is not whether my neighbor is a good person or a bad person. In that case, you are talking about marrying into the family. So when you are making foreign policy, it is not the intentions that count, but it is a capacity that matters. And probably we don't read it carefully. We look at the intentions of nations. That's a fundamental mistake we make. We should look at the capacities constantly. The issue is not, for instance, I'll give an example of Iranian missiles. The discussions in India on Iran missile is, okay, it is direct against Israel. Fine. But tell me, can Iran use the same missile against India? Of course it can, because the world did not see a missile which flies only in one direction. Bombay High is within the striking distance of an Iranian missile. So when you make a foreign policy formulation or a strategic doctrine, you don't look at only Iran-Israel tension. You look at the Iranian military capabilities. I think that is a mistake we make. That is, you look at the capacity, not intentions.
Right, sir. And another question is from Yatharth, sir. He mentions, I think, and I would convey, India-Israel relationship improved a lot under the current, the Modi government, right? And like you said, and do you see if, since foreign policy is also based on personality and leadership, political leadership, so do you say if there is change of a leadership, the relation is, would relations also change and go? I think would it change if the leadership is changed, sir?
The impact of change of leadership is very marginal. Because even under UPA government, with all the criticism and everything, the military remained the driver of the bilateral relation. What is happening is, with the decentralization of the bilateral relations, a farmer in Haryana and a farmer in Punjab is more interested in the relations with Israel than the political discourses. And therefore, there might be a minor variations. Israel may not figure prominently in public statements, but the basic contours are very strong. It is driven by two major forces, I would say. One is the Ministry of Defense, which is simply non-partisan in its approach. And now, Ministry of Agriculture, which once again is non-partisan. It wants people to get more harvest, less water, water management, irrigation, horticulture, floriculture, everything else. So therefore, they're not bothered about who is the prime minister. And in both countries. And that is why when Netanyahu left office, did Israel relations ended? No. And Prime Minister met Bennett in Glasgow. And by the way, he even invited Bennett to come to India. Such a short notice. Netanyahu came in 2018. So Bennett took office only a few months ago. Already he got an invitation to India. So therefore, I don't think, personalities do matter, but not to the point of completely derailing the relations, for the simple reason the basic contours are strong. Their fundamentals are strong.
Right, sir. I think we have a question from Aditya, sir. Aditya, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Ankit. Sir, it's always pleasure and enlightening to hear you. Sir, you just mentioned about Iran, and you also mentioned about the newly created Quad in the Gulf, which is expected to expand. But we see a common thing among the countries who have joined the Quad and would join the Quad is that Iran is a kind of a thorn in their eyes. So how do you see Iran affecting India's relation with wider Gulf countries?
Iran is somewhat unhappy even without the Quad. Okay, that Quad is only one part of the story. And if you look at Iran's policies rather carefully, Iran says no external power in the Persian Gulf. They don't want anybody to come into Persian Gulf because they see it as an Iranian lake. And that applies to India. We don't pay attention to that. It is not that Iran is very happy for India to have a role. No. But while the Arab countries want us to play a greater role, Iran is not very eager. So that is that even without the war. But at the same time, Israel has a problem with Iran, and UAE has a disagreement with Iran because as a neighbor of Iran, you don't have a space. And India does. We do have a problem with Iran. I don't think that we have reached a point of joining hands with Israel to fight. So all the four countries will have to manage the Iran fight carefully. If it's a Trump administration, I would say differently. But the Biden administration doesn't want a confrontation with Iran. And therefore, if we put all of them, okay, we may follow a different policy on Iran, but that will not be the common denominator. That's what there is going to be. And I think people are mature enough. And if you look at the Iranians are Bazaris, and the Emiratis are also Bazaris. It's surely because of business they are there where they are today. So I don't think they will be suicidal in making, okay, let's join hands with against Iran. No. There will be disagreements, but that will not be the common denominator.
Thank you, sir. I think, Kritika, you have a question. You can go ahead.
Sir, it's so great to meet you after such a long time, sir. So my question to you is that you talked about how it is very difficult to get military technology from Israel. They will not give it to you easily. And you mentioned that how we should encourage Israeli companies to come in India. So apart from encouraging Israeli companies, what other means are there for us to have more technological cooperation with them in specifically in terms of military collaboration as such?
Thank you very much. It's nice to see you. Most of them, it's nice to see after so many period. Israeli companies coming to India is the one which we are looking at. We want them to invest in India, especially in R&D and defense. But I don't think that will be the long-term solution to our problem. I would simply buy Israeli companies. This is what I argued when Prime Minister was in Israel. You should come simply with a shopping list. These are the companies, these are the technologies critical for me. I'm going to buy it. That's it. And either it can be a wholesale purchase or even 10%, 15% of the shares, because these are all traded. It's openly available. You don't have to do anything extraordinary. You can either India can do as in the government level, or even ask the private sector to simply say, this is my mandate, don't do it. Because that's the only way out. And that is how it's going to be done. Because asking the Israeli companies to invest in India, they can. Because we have a huge substantial market. But the question is the working ethics are pretty different. And therefore, I would say that, if you really want the Israeli technology, latest technology, be a partner in that company. I would say instead of Israeli investment in India, I would suggest Indian investment in Israeli companies. Very selective one, not across one. You can simply say what is the most critical for our long-term interests. Either you can do it yourself, or you can simply ask a consortium of private sector to do that. You can simply ask them, hey, 4 or 5 companies, do it. And I think, that's the way forward.
Right, sir. Anyone else? Any questions? Divya ma'am, you have a question? You can go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Always very nice listening to you, and there's always something new to learn. Sir, this is something I keep asking you, sir. What is your prognosis about Pakistan-Israel relations? And if it ever normalizes, would it impact India-Israel relations? And if not, sir, Have we reached a point of no return with Israel?
No. You see, once upon a time, the world was a zero-sum game. If you are an ally of the United States, you can't deal with the Soviet Union. The end of the Cold War completely destroyed that bipolarity. Now it's a multipolar world. With all the problems with China, we also cooperate with China in certain fields. The same thing with Russia. With all the cooperation, we also disagree with Russia on so many fields. So it is no longer possible that no, with me A to Z. It's no longer possible. Number one. Which means Israel-Pakistan relations, it is inevitable. Sooner or later it will happen. Because if you read the Pakistani press for the last 30 years, very periodically they are saying we should revisit the subject, we should re-examine it, we should have relations. And the logic is simple. If you can't beat them, join them. They tried to demonize India as a collaborator with Israel against the Islamic world. They tried it even before 92. It didn't work. And now what they see in the last 30 years is India-Israel relation is actually progressing without any barriers. And therefore, there is a powerful force within Pakistan for normalization. If you read the statement of S.M. Krishna in Israel, and he said that very clearly that we understand the compulsions. And actually, rather than focusing on Pakistan, we should have focused on China. And I was arguing from 1994. And nobody in India took this China-Israel military relations seriously. And by the time they are talking about China-Israel military relations, the relations actually stopped. Thanks to America. So we were way behind the curve. So Pakistan-Israel relations will happen. And which is actually good for Israel. It is good for Pakistan. Is it good for India? It depends upon what is happening between Israel and Pakistan. Israel cannot do what China did to the Iran-Iraq war. If you read the text carefully, the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980 to 88, the other countries, Russia and the United States, was not ready to supply weapons. So the Chinese were supplying weapons to both the parties. They are supplying weapons to Iran, they were supplying weapons to Iraq. So Israel cannot do that. I will do technological cooperation with India as well as Pakistan. That is where Israel will have to draw a line. I don't think that India have to say anything. Because the moment you cooperate with Israel on the military dimension, Israel is signing a death warrant. It's a point of no return. And therefore, Israel also knows what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. What is worthwhile doing in India, what is worthwhile doing in Pakistan. I think that would be reasonably clear. So the relations, I think it happened sometime sooner. But at the same time, there are opinion in Pakistan which says, we should be more Arab than Arafat. So even after Saudi Arabia normalizes relations, there will still be some in Pakistan who don't want to have relations with Israel. And that is largely because of the baggage of 47. You put yourself in a corner of being a Islamic country, Islamic homeland and everything. But then you have to justify it. So Pakistan finds itself in that situation. At the same time, the reality is more countries are opening up to Israel. And you know that, a lot of countries have formal relations. At the same time, countries like Qatar has an informal relationship. So then probably you can say the entire Middle East, only Kuwait is hostile towards Israel, and Yemen civil war, and Iran. So you can simply say Kuwait, Pakistan, and Iran are the three most hostile countries in the region. Okay, you can find the company.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. I think I would just like to make a mention that Dr. L. White, who is member of our Board of Studies for Master's Program as well, is here present with us, sir. You're mute, sir.
Sir, this would be a wild card for me entry. My supervisor is speaking, and it's always delightful to hear my sir. After a long time, I'm hearing sir speaking on this subject. I refrain myself from asking this question, sir, but you, I think, thanks to Divya for raising this question, and sir also touching about the Chinese factor. There is also a kind of a belief that the more we are engaging with Israelis on the military security sector, on the other side, the Chinese and the Pakistanis military, cooperation is also going to be on the rise. And this has been spoken by none other than one of your very good friends, Yitzhak Shikor, Professor Shikor. So what is your opinion on that? If you have to, see this comparison between us and Israel on one side, and on the other side, you have China and Pakistan. So any sort of
that's a very interesting parallel you are looking at it. That is, the closer we go towards Israel, China would probably get closer to Pakistan. No, it's a China-Pakistan relation is independent of Israel. That we need to accept it. It's no matter what we look at, it's there from 1950. And what is possible is that China might use its anger with Israel to be more aggressive with Pakistan in terms of technology and everything. I think that is where Israelis are actually, what I would say, doing the insurance policy framework by collaborating with China and the BRI. Okay, if you look at even though nobody speaks about that, all the infrastructure program, they are more active in Israel than any other country in the region. And they are building the Haifa port, which is used by the US fleet. They are building another terminal in Ashkelon. They are building the Eilat Ashkelon railways. They are talking about even Eilat Haifa pipeline if it materializes. They have built the tunnels in Haifa. So therefore, if you put all of them, their investment in Israel is very, very substantial. And this has happened in the last 10 years after Netanyahu's visit. And therefore, by doing this with China, even facing the American criticism, Israel has got sufficient leeway with China. And I think that is where, Israel is able to manage itself with India. But let's be very clear. There are limits to what Israel can do. Israel does not produce platforms like aircrafts, tanks, and ships and everything. It only provides you the adds-on, avionics, technology, small weapons, electronics, surveillance, and countermeasures. And therefore, there are limits to how much Israel and India military relationship can go, unless you come up with more dramatic transformation. And India is now more actively engaged with the US on the military front. And then if you read it carefully, it is not to Israel's liking. Because they feel that, I am providing something, the Americans will come and do the wholesale of things and then make me irrelevant. And which is possible because, in terms of payment, in terms of deferred payment, concessional prices, and all of them, US has a greater strength than Israelis. So if you look at all of them, and China-Pakistan relations may intensify, but independent of Israel-India relationship. And that too, I would be more to do with India-China relationship rather than India-Israel relationship. If you have a much better equation with Beijing, probably China may even slow down with Pakistan. So it's more to do with the bilateral relations rather than getting Israel into the picture.
Thank you, sir.
And one small thing, my friend, I was your supervisor. Okay, that's once upon an ancient history. So
all habits die hard, sir. Yeah.
no, but it's okay. That's what a statement.
Right, sir.
Right.
Thank you.
Upon a time, so it's
We
not
have a
much.
question from. Thank you, sir. Just a question from Abhishek who joins us. He's asking that, sir, regarding you mentioned regarding the gestation period or period issue of India. does it have the potential of derailing this new Quad before it even expands to include new members?
Yes, left to India, yes, we will derail it. It will become another talk shop. Actually, the only thing will happen is cutting ribbons and photograph and things like that. Left to ourselves. Unfortunately, the other three guys are serious. They don't want photo opportunities. They don't want statements. They don't want, meeting opportunities. These guys travel a lot. COVID or no COVID. Therefore, they will force India to increase the pace. It's by default. Not that you want it. That's what I argue. If we simply look at the capacities, India should not be part of the Quad. Honestly. But then they recognize there is only one. I tried all the things bilaterally. It doesn't work. The Israelis are not very happy with our pace. The Emiratis are equally unhappy. The Americans are constantly complaining. So therefore, they said, okay, let's join and put India on the track. So therefore, India will be pushed by all the three countries to change. I think that's the good news for us. We will see, if you look at it, we never do things, sensible things, voluntarily. It is always under duress. By compulsion, we do the right thing. And therefore, Quad is, I would say, a blessing for us. It may not be liked by others for the simple reason you cannot promote Quad only with South Bloc. You can't. You need the North Bloc, economic ministries. So therefore, which means they need to redefine that. So much of the Quad activities will be undertaken by the economic ministries and the private sector, not by the government. So therefore, which basically means inefficiency will simply have to be reduced. I'm not saying it will disappear, it will be reduced.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. I think we have 3 minutes. We can take 1 or 2 questions more. If anyone has any question, you can raise your hand or directly ask to the speaker. Any other questions?
You can also ask, no?
So since my knowledge on the region is, I think I'm still learning. There's always a lot to learn from you. So I'm just refraining myself from asking any questions. Anyone?
Junjun has something. Junjun has something, I think. She just came in.
Ma'am, do you have a question? There's a bit of connectivity issue with
Okay, no issues.
I believe. So, all right, I think we close the question answer session as I see that there are no other questions. So we are now into the conclusion of our talk today. On behalf of the Director, School of Internal Security, Defense and Strategic Studies, Lieutenant General Asit Mistry, sir, PVSM, AVSM, SM and VSM, I thank you so much, sir, for taking out time and giving us your insightful understanding of the issue of the topic India-Israel relations. On behalf of Rashtriya Raksha University, the IT team and everyone who has worked there, thanks to Divya ma'am and Aditya for coordinating with you to organize this lecture. Thank you, students, faculty members, scholars, and subject matter experts. Thank you, Dr. Alvite, for joining us today. We continue to have, may the associations or the talks like this and interaction like this, we look forward to it. Junjun ma'am says thank you to you, sir.
I know, thanks.
Right.
Thank you very much for the opportunities, because I look forward to much more engaging session as often as possible. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunities. Looking forward to meeting all of you again. Hopefully in person in JNU.
Right, sir. Right, sir. Thank you so much. And
Thank
just
you
for
very
the audience, just for the general information of the audience, this is the weekly expert lecture series, which we conduct every Wednesday. And it is generally around in the afternoon. So I invite you all. We will soon have, you can follow us on our social media and you can follow us on our website. Thank you so much for all joining in. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Director, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Director.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.